How could people continue to adhere to an ideology like that during the murderous time period, and even more after the murderous time period when we can look at it dispassionately? Here's part of the answer. Again, young people are attracted to impatient, quick, total transformation of the world, eradication of war, eradication of social injustice. And there's a simplicity to the ideology. It's kind of a total package.
Yeah.
It gets rid of everything bad just if you follow the precepts. And so, sure, things happen that shouldn't have happened. There are some surprises. There are some downsides. But are you pro-capitalism? Are you pro-imperialist war? Are you pro-landowners having all the land and the have-nots having nothing? So there's this constant threat where if you contravene the ideology, you're in bed with the very evils that the ideology is trying to overcome. So you become an accomplice in the persistence of the things that you're dedicated to overthrowing. So it's not just that you're loyal to the party. You're loyal to the outcome that the party is dedicated to achieving. And you know that there are going to be mistakes and costs and bad things happen along the way. But hey, is imperialist war better than that? No. The answer is imperialist war has got to be worse.
Right.
And so but the other reason, which is even deeper than that, is because Marxism-Leninism empowers the intellectual class and the lumpen intellectual class. You see, in a market system, you get to do what you want. You want to open up a family business? You want to take a loan and give it a try? You can do that. Nobody can stop you. Now, it might be that it's hard to get the loan in some neighborhoods. It might be that the loan interest rate, you got to work much harder than you thought, etc. But you get to make the decisions. You get to decide what to do, when to do. You can work for somebody else. You can put out your own shingle. In these kind of systems, it's the intellectuals and the lumpen intellectuals who make those decisions. They use the state as an instrument to overcome the injustices of the existing society. Again, the injustices are real. But that empowers them to be in charge. So the beauty of Marxism-Leninism, and why what we used to call the third world loves this, is because they get to be in power. It empowers them across the board. They get to make the decisions on the economy, and they don't have to submit to elections. They don't have to have a mandate. They don't have to legitimate their rule beyond the ideological building of a new world, of overcoming injustice. So what we see again and again is young people being impatient for evil to end, but also empowering themselves to be in charge. They love the state. They love the state as an instrument for social justice, social engineering. They love to empower themselves as the decision makers because, after all, they're the intellectuals. They've studied the theory. They know better than others. Workers and peasants and the downtrodden, the lower classes, they sometimes have false consciousness. They don't understand why, for example, we have imperialist war. They get sucked in. Bread and circuses fools them. They have this false consciousness, but I know better, and I can be in charge, and I can get us to a better place. Even along the way, bad things are going to happen. Some people who are innocent are going to die or be arrested. But this is the march of history. This march of history is to peace and justice. And who is going to stand in the way of that, especially when it empowers you personally, so that you could never do this in the private sector. Nobody could afford you this kind of power in the private sector. And in a decentralized political system, in a federalized political system, where nobody accumulates that much power. Social engineering is always coercive. Always coercive. The issue is how much of the coercion is necessary that we accept in the trade-off to right some of the things that are obviously wrong.
All the anti-Marxism I totally agree with, but I still think from a purely just like analyzing the system, there's many ideologies, and you have this line that you often have that, look, you can't explain Stalin by saying that he was beaten by as a kid or he's a Georgian or whatever, because many other people are Georgians or beaten as a kid, and they turn out not this way. There's many different kinds of ideologies,
For sure.
and very few of them end up as amenable to dictatorship as Marxism. And you also, another thing that's really confusing here is that all of these old Bolsheviks who abet the system and who eventually Stalin purges, they're, whatever you might say about them, they're not weak men, right? They were willing to face down the Tsar. They were able to organize the revolution against the Tsar, and they're willing to live in exile to potentially get shot by the Oranka. I guess not shot by the Oranka, but whatever. They're willing to go through hardships for their beliefs. So you might think, well, okay, they might just go along with Stalin's doing because this serves what they think is the end goal of communism. But we know that after Stalin died, Khrushchev, who was one of the key people in the regime, gives a secret speech where he says that no, Stalin was going against. He was destroying the building of socialism and the building of Marxism-Leninism. So people did believe that Stalin is actually going against this end goal that they have. At least Khrushchev believed that. And there's also in many cases they themselves are being implicated and they know they're innocent. And in many of these cases, there's this period in between when they're a dead man walking because Stalin has started putting, the Met feelers out that this person is a Trotskyite or something, but they're still in their positions of power. They're still the editor of Pravda or in charge of the military or something. And it's mysterious why these people who, they're not cowards, they're able to organize a revolution against the Tsar, are not using this period of, chicken with its head cut off in order to organize some sort of defense of themselves. Maybe the next time they have the party plenum, instead of just confessing or giving the obligatory a speech where you're castigate yourself, you just say, no, I think Stalin's leading the revolution wrong. I'm going to die either way, but I might as well say this. The same thing happens in China. Li Shaipo, when he's a dead man walking, the premier under Mao during the Cultural Revolution, he doesn't use that opportunity to go up to...
There are very few, but there are some people like that. And they're arrested and executed. All of them. Very few of those kind of people are going to survive. The ones who publicly decry the failures of the system and its perverse and unintended consequences, the ones who decry the dictatorship as opposed to the freedom that Marx predicted would happen, right? There are some people like that. They're extremely courageous. They're known to us. I'm not the only one, but I featured some of them in my book. But again, you're creating a new world. And it's going to be messy because it's about class struggle. And class struggle means there are going to be winners and losers. And the bourgeoisie have to go. They're inherently evil. They're an evil class. They have to not just be retired to a farm somewhere, they have to be eradicated, liquidated as a class. And so they're going to resist. And therefore, they're going to be enemies everywhere. And again, you're not going to know who they are. So are you on the side of the enemies?
But what about the cases where they're implicating themselves? They know they're not an enemy, right?
But again, the party is larger cause than they are. You're building a new world. Your life can contribute to that or not. And it's insignificant ultimately.
What fraction of confessions by high-level party members do you think were not coerced out of a sense of fear of their own lives or their family's lives? Well, I guess they knew they were going to execute it, so it would have to be for their family's life or to avoid torture versus in order, it was a very sort of Ozymandian, like, I will sacrifice myself for the...
So we're in the level of psychology here, DK.
Yeah.
And it's human psychology is a complex subject. Figuring out human psychology is a big challenge, even with everything we know now, let alone what we knew then. So it's simultaneously everything and anything. We have to get rid of the binaries where, they didn't believe, they were cynical, and they sacrificed themselves because they were cowards or because they knew that they were forced to make that sacrifice to preserve some of their family members or whatever. There are elements of belief and elements of, let's say, suspension of disbelief, and elements of cynicism and knowledge and understanding simultaneously in almost everybody. They coexist. We think of them as contradictory, but humans can hold contradictory thoughts simultaneously without too much trouble. We could give many examples. You've had people like that on your show, for example, right? So the psychology is not as surprising in some ways. What's surprising is that this whole thing succeeds. It doesn't collapse of its own internal contradictions. It doesn't undermine itself. If you're murdering a high percentage of your upper officer corps, if you're murdering your intellectuals, your scientists, your cultural figures, if you're murdering your loyal party elites, centrally and in the provinces, and if you're murdering the police who are carrying out all of these murders. The thing about Stalin's terror is the police are also murdered during the terror while they are doing the murdering. You're doing all of that, and the whole thing doesn't collapse. To me, that's more interesting in some ways than the complexity of human psychology that holds these contradictory thoughts and fails to go for self-preservation in some cases, or fails to say, I'm going to die anyway, I might as well go down fighting, or whatever the metaphor might be. And so the fact that the system is able to undergo this level of self-disruption and come out the other side, that's pretty astonishing. So Hitler does not murder his upper officer corps. He doesn't like them, he retires them, and they get a pension. He doesn't murder the Gauleiters or the Nazi party officials. He doesn't murder the intellectuals. Some go to prison, some go into exile if they're lucky, and some definitely are executed, often for acts that they've committed, sometimes just because they had an enemy in the system who wanted to enact revenge against them. But for the most part, Hitler is attacking what we would call his real enemies. That is to say, people who are opposed to his regime, either in thought or in action or both. Stalin is attacking those people, but he's also attacking loyalists. He's taking down in really big numbers system loyalists, people who would walk
let's talk about
fire for him. And one of the things they do is to walk through the fire of their self-immolation on behalf of the cause. And this belief in the new world, in the better world, in transcending capitalism, in getting peace as well as abundance on the planet, in building paradise on Earth, needs to be understood as absolutely fundamental to everything that we're talking about. We often talk about Nazi racial ideology. How could they believe that stuff? That stuff is obviously ridiculous, you say, right? Goebbels, who helped enact the regime's ideology about a master race, had several deformities, right? Club foot, walked in a brace, and yet he's helping preside over the murder of people because they are disabled. They're singled out solely for their disabilities to be sent to the gas chambers or to be sent to imprisonment. And he's one of them. And so we say, could he really have believed this? I mean, wasn't he a cynic enacting this? Because how could he not understand that these are real people because he's one of them? And the answer is, well, yes, he was a Nazi. These people were communists, and he was a Nazi, and there were a lot of them. And they had doubts. They suffered bouts of doubt. A lot of events contradicted the official ideology. Innocent people, innocent family members, themselves innocent, went to the gallows, got the bullet in the back of the neck. And so you say, God, the belief, they couldn't have believed this stuff, and yet they did. The main thing that we know from the archives that were formerly secret, that we get into when they're declassified, is that the Nazis were Nazis, and the communists were communists. So here we have this problem with socialism. Socialism means many different things, right? A communist party is building socialism. Why? Because their view of the world is feudalism, capitalism, socialism, communism. So first they have to destroy capitalism to get to socialism, and then socialism can eventually get you to communism. So the Communist Party must first build socialism. How do you build socialism? It doesn't exist. So how do we know what it looks like? How do you get there? They don't know. The only thing they know is it's not capitalism. So let's destroy capitalism. That will be the step to get us to socialism. So capitalism has markets, we'll have planning. Capitalism has private property, we'll have state property or collective property. Capitalism has bourgeois parliaments where they vote and they claim it's democracy, but it's only for the property-holding bourgeoisie, so we will have a dictatorship of the proletariat, right? Everything, capitalism has wage slavery, right? That is to say...
real slavery.
Exactly. But everything is eradicate capitalism to get you to socialism. It turns out that that doesn't deliver freedom, it doesn't deliver prosperity, and it doesn't deliver peace. It delivers massive statization, because once you eliminate private property and individual choice, the state is now responsible for everything, and it delivers ration tickets and the gulag. So you get a bunch of socialists that break from this. They say, you know what? Lenin is wrong. Eradicating private property, markets, civil liberties, and parliament is a mistake. We have to accept private property, markets, capitalism, and parliaments, because that's the only way to get to freedom. Otherwise, you get to the Leninist dictatorship, total statization, gulag, and ration tickets. These people are denounced as revisionists, like Edward Bernstein in Germany, for example, the Swedish Social Democrats. They say, we accept capitalism, markets, and private property. We want to redistribute the income, because it's tough for some people to make their way in the system. The system produces inequality, and let's make it more equal with social engineering, redistribution, but we keep capitalism, we keep markets and private property, and we keep democracy, voting, rule of law, etc., and we'll evolve towards full socialism and eventually communism, but we will not do it the Leninist way. And so there's this huge break in the socialist movement between those who are real revolutionaries and want to overthrow, eradicate capitalism to get to the just and prosperous and peaceful future, and those who want to use the existing system and evolve, embrace and accept it. So the left has a civil war on the left, which is still going on, between those who say capitalism is evil and must go, versus capitalism has a lot of problems, but we need it in order to have peace and prosperity, in order to have freedom, and we just need to manage it better, redistribute. And so this civil war on the left, which arises in real time, the critics of Lenin's revolution, the German Social Democratic Party, people like Bernstein and the rest of them, they are critics in real time of this. And yet, some of the critics, who are what we would call the Social Democrats of Europe, Lenin was also a member of the Social Democratic Party of Russia, but the communist thing makes this divide between those who are serious about destruction of capitalism and those who are, quote, revisionists, this denunciatory term. What happens is, some of the people who are in the revisionist camp begin to flirt with the capitalism is evil analysis. And so they begin to truck with the communists that they've broken from and are in civil war with. So you get left-wing social democrats who are closer to Lenin than they are to right-wing social democrats like Bernstein and the rest, who are pro-capitalism but pro-redistribution. And so this is confusing to people because not everybody is a communist. Some people, like in Sweden, accept private property and markets. But some of the people in Sweden seem to go back on that promise of accepting it and arguing that if we don't get rid of capitalism, we're still going to end up with an evil system. And so this civil war on the left never gets resolved. It's ongoing. And the right uses this confusion to paint everybody as anti-capitalism. And the left gives them ammunition by talking about the evils of capitalism, even when they've come along to accept private property and markets. And so you have this really deep and fundamental problem for the left, the tragedy of the left that it's never able to overcome, even to this day, where it comes out and says, no more anti-capitalism ever. That is over. That leads to death, bloodshed, gulag, ration tickets, war. That actually is worse than the solution, than the original problem it diagnosed. Think about Marx. Marx says, you get rid of private property, markets, capitalism, you're going to get freedom, you're going to get abundance. You don't get that. And then people say, oh, you know, but Marx wanted freedom. He didn't want Stalin's dictatorship. So it's not Marx who's the problem. It's Stalin who deformed Marx. We see this argument all the time. Stalin is a deformity, whereas Marx was about freedom. So think about a nuclear bomb. You're going to do a nuclear bomb. You're going to nuke a population, but you don't want to kill any people. Your goal is to nuke them, but nobody dies. That's what you say. You're going to get rid of capitalism, you're going to nuke them, but instead everybody's going to live. Yeah. And you give that order to your generals. You say, nuke them, but everybody lives, nobody dies. So they nuke them, and everybody dies instead of everybody living. Yeah. And you say, you know, I never said to kill the people. I said that they should live. But once you nuke capitalism, you're going to lose freedom. You're going to lose the ability to have politics. You're going to end up with some version of a Leninist system. And the ideology is going to drive that to the doubters. And then you're going to get a second wind where you get Khrushchev, like you said. He comes into power. He denounces Stalin's crimes. He doesn't praise capitalism, private property, and markets. He doesn't undo collective farms. He doesn't undo state ownership of property. He doesn't undo the planning system. He just undoes Stalin's personality. Yeah. He's trying to subtract. The de-Stalinization is take away Stalin. It's not take away any of the other attributes of the system. And so it's a second wind that it was Stalin who was the problem, not the system that was the problem. So here we have the experience of going through the horrors, then having those horrors publicly denounced within the party. The secret speech is not published in Soviet newspapers, but it's discussed at party meetings in all locales. So within the party, there's a public dimension to this. All party members become familiar with Khrushchev's denunciation of Stalin. So they experienced the horrors in many cases firsthand. They enacted the horrors in many cases themselves. They then see this denounced as horror, and they get facts that they didn't know. They get a big picture view back onto this. And instead of saying, oh my God, this system is evil, we made a big mistake. We have to undo state ownership of property. We have to undo collective farms. We have to undo the dictatorship. Instead of saying that, they say, oh, we get a chance to do it right this time, without the evil Stalin who messed it all up. And so the Khrushchev thing, the revelation of the horrors, the denunciation of the horrors, ironically, gives you the second wind belief in the system that's going to last right through Gorbachev, who's a Khrushchev-era baby. We have this with Xi Jinping. If you know the story of his father and of his own upbringing, they suffer massively through Mao's regime and the Cultural Revolution. They're purged, they're humiliated. And yet, instead of saying, this system is horrible, if I ever get power, I'm going to undo this system, which was so unjust to me and my family. Instead of that, they say, let's make this better. Let's not have the bad things that happened under Mao, but let's keep all the good things, supposedly good things that happened, including the Communist Party monopoly, because that to us looks like the problem, and it wreaked havoc in their lives, in their family's life, but to them, that's the solution. And so this is paradoxical element of communism, where its failures don't become discrediting for so many of the people. Right. They instead become a kind of second wind once you acknowledge and denounce them. So it's never the system at fault. It's Stalin at fault. It's never the system at fault. It's Mao's mistakes or excesses, as they're called, that are at fault.
I guess in China's case, they actually did reform the system and didn't just they didn't just discredit the Cultural Revolution. They said no, much of the planning and state-owned enterprises was a mistaken idea. But I do have a different question.
That's not exactly the way you described. You have a point. You're onto something, DK, but it needs to be qualified. So what happens in Deng Xiaoping's case is the communists have accidentally, that is unwittingly, not accidentally, unwittingly destroyed the planning system. Yep. They have sent down to the village people who do economic planning. They've sent them to manual labor. They have smashed them in the face because they wear glasses in many cases, and therefore they're putatively intellectuals. And so they've undermined their ability to continue the economic system as they had it.
But if that's the reason why they weren't able to do planning, shouldn't Stalin's purges and then World War II have also had the same effect on the Soviet Union?
Not the political system. Deng Xiaoping never takes down the political system or the ideology. And so you still have today the communist monopoly. Communism can fail at everything. It can starve the people. It can kill the people. It only has to do one thing to survive: suppress political alternatives. So during that resistance, peasant resistance to Stalin in the collectivization episode that you referenced earlier, there's no political alternative. There's no other place for them to go and say, we don't like the injustices of the Tsarist regime, and we don't like what communism is doing, therefore there's something else that we can go to that's an alternative. Communism has suppressed all the alternatives. So it's either return to Tsarism or keep communism.
Right.
And so in the Chinese case, you have something quite similar. They allow economic liberalization, in part because they have no choice. But they don't allow political liberalization.
Right.
And so they're able to, quote, reform, by enabling the people to generate wealth, jobs, prosperity through market behavior, and it's mostly the peasant class in China, which then leads to family-owned businesses, which then leads to larger businesses. And so society, not the party, creates the miracle in China. And the party tightens its grip because the ideology of the party is when the socioeconomic base has a lot of market in it, it's a threat to the party's rule. So the party has to be even more vigilant against the capitalists in the society. And it turns out that you get to Jiang Zemin, who is Deng Xiaoping's handpicked successor. And Jiang Zemin sees that the private sector is becoming dominant in the country and that the party's monopoly on power is under threat. And Jiang Zemin decides he's going to do something called the Three Represents. He's going to bring the millionaire capitalists into the party. He's going to make them party members. So instead of the party being against capitalists, the capitalists are going to join the party, and this is going to somehow increase the party's leverage and control and transform the psychology and behavior of the capital. Of course, it fails. Instead, the party members are in cahoots with the millionaires, and they begin to form their own businesses by expropriating other people's property, and the party begins to go dissolute in an anti-Marxist fashion in terms of private property, wealth accumulation. So Xi Jinping comes along. Predictably, he looks at Jiang Zemin's solution, co-opt the millionaires into the party, sees that it failed. Not only did it fail to transform the behavior of the private sector people, it infected the behavior of the party people. So he's going to, instead of bringing the capitalists into the party, he's going to force the party back into the capitalism. So he's going to push the party into the private sector more strongly than it was before. Board directors, party officials. CEO, party official. Private sector people who don't cooperate, destroy them, make examples of them, including in the tech sector, so that people get the message that the party is the boss here. So you have a kind of natural progression where you open up the system economically in order to drive jobs, prosperity, wealth, because you've destroyed. People say the Communist Party brought 700, 800 million people out of poverty. No. The Communist Party put those people into poverty. Why are a billion plus people in poverty? Because of the party's rule. It's the people themselves, they lift themselves out of poverty. And so the communists have to reassert their control, their Leninist monopoly on power, because the very thing that has rescued them, the diligence, entrepreneurialism, ingenuity of the amazing Chinese people and of that society, is now a threat to communist rule.
I mean, I agree with the mechanism by which the growth happened, but I don't think it's the I don't think it's the case that it was their inability to have true Marxist communism which led to liberalization. I mean, if you look at the creation of these special economic zones, the imperative at the national level that you must have growth, and then Deng's southern tour. And so Jiang Zemin, he tries after Tiananmen to clamp down on these clamp down on opening up, and Deng says, no, we must open up. If you don't, you'll remove you. All of that is a sort of positive. Maybe positive is the wrong word, but
policy driven.
Yeah, it's a special effort you have to make towards economic liberalization. It didn't just happen by default. People really had to push for it, because the alternative story, which seems you were saying, is no, it was just that they physically could not enforce communism anymore.
That's how it started, DK. So let's go look at the facts. Why do you have a special economic zone? Why can't every zone have market
but then
relations?
the creation of that zone had to be a proactive
You're doing this
action.
grudgingly. This is a grudging allowance of certain behavior. So you look at the decrees. You can trade onions, but you can't trade potatoes. Okay, you can trade potatoes, but you can trade only on Tuesdays and Thursdays, not Monday, Wednesday, Friday.
You can only have 3 employees, otherwise it's a corporation. Yeah.
So the decrees are all grudging, with very few exceptions, and the society is forcing more and more concessions onto the ideologues in the Marxist-Leninist system. So at the beginning, it's launched by the party's grudging acceptance that the society is going to rebuild and not starve through its own hard work. So they've been through a couple of famines here. I mean, really big famines. They don't have the state capacity to reimpose the system immediately in the economic sphere. So they grudgingly make concessions, very few, but some in the market sphere. Gradually, that expands over time as more and more people push against the system's restrictions. And so it's a policy-driven story in part, but not as the lead. It's a policy-driven story as the following of the entrepreneurialism and the hard work of the system.
But that pushback is coming from within. This is your thesis on uncivil society, right? That
yes.
It is coming from within the system. Because they could have, I mean, in 1976, they're like North Korea, literally. And North Korea still exists, right? There's no reason.
North Korea doesn't have the Cultural Revolution where it annihilates its state capacity in a Maoist frenzy in order for Mao to, in his mind, undo his rivals, unbalance and destabilize them.
They have,
yes, they do, but they still have the mechanisms of economic control, and they have a massive black market. You got to remember that the communism doesn't have legal markets for the most part. It has restricted legal markets, again, grudgingly, household plots. But for the most part, it has a lot of illegal market activity, including in the state sector. So the state sector gets an order to produce certain numbers of large quantitative output for the military-industrial sector, but it only gets allocated 25% of its ball bearings. So it has to assign its supply department on the black market to go out and find the other ball bearings that it's not assigned from central planning. So you get a massive black market in the system, not just at the level of little people in the village, but at the top level of the military industrial complex to make the system work. So when market behavior is grudgingly accepted, what that does is it brings market behavior out of the shadows into a legal or quasi-legal realm. So you're not inventing market behavior from scratch. You're surfacing it in some ways. And so party officials and industrial officials, they have market behavior in their firms to grease the system and to meet their output quotas.
I agree with their general point that how any nation gets wealthy is not by the government, but because of the thrift and entrepreneurialism and hard work of individuals. But that's also true in Western capitalist countries. In those countries, we also have a lot of stupid policies. And
as we sit here and speak,
when we say America is a capitalist country, what we say is like the government or all the bureaucrats, they'll try to put in all these regulations, and it's only grudgingly that they will accede to. We could point to a bunch of stupid policies in America where like they try to outlaw the potatoes and the onions, but they could only outlaw the potatoes, equivalence things. So any capitalist society, quote unquote, is just a case where the government had to accede some amount of control. And we give credit to capitalist countries in the West for saying like at least the government wasn't maximally stupid.
Fair point, DK. Fair point. We often exaggerate the role of policy in all realms because we do policy ourselves or we talk to policymakers. We have a bias towards the causality of policy. So America is 25% of the global economy since 1880.
Yeah.
We've had no income tax. We've had income tax. We've had high income tax. We've had low income tax. We've had tariffs. We've had fewer tariffs. We've had all sorts of regulations. We've had deregulation. For 150 years, more or less, we've been around 25% of global GDP, which is 5% of the population, through every imaginable variety of policy regime. That doesn't mean that policy is inconsequential. It matters for a lot of players in the system. It matters for those who get the policy turned in their direction, the subsidies or the tax breaks or the taxes on their competitors or whatever it might be. There's a lot of gaming of the system, and it does matter. But in the larger picture of things, you can't create the wealth of the United States over those 150 years, that global economic dominance, and you can't strangle it in the policy realm. You can affect it, but you can't either create or strangle it. And so we have to understand in the communist sense that incentives matter. We know that. And so when you create incentives for officials to increase GDP and to increase job creation, and that's how they get rewarded, you're going to get a lot of that behavior. And the party will do that not immediately. Remember, immediately they're kind of flat on their back, and they've had this Gang of Four, and Deng Xiaoping has come back from having been purged, and they're on the verge of another potential famine, and per capita GDP under Mao is $200 during the Cultural Revolution. $200 is the annual per capita GDP of 1 billion people, and or slightly under. And you think, that's insane. That's where all the people are in poverty. When I was saying the regime put them in poverty. And so they're a little bit flat on their back, which creates an opening, and it creates this grudging dynamic of we're going to hold power, and we're going to allow the economic entrepreneurialism to take place, but we're going to control it. We're going to control it with special economic zones.
In any country in the world today where there's a lot of poverty, the reason the poverty exists is also because of policy. And the extent the poverty has been removed, it is because some combination of human capital and policy got less stupid. So if we're going to complain about a country like, there's many poor countries in the world, like Bangladesh being poor, the country which just does it less, maybe we're going in circles here. A different question I want to ask is...
No, you have a point. We're not disagreeing. I'm just trying to say that we give too much credit to the Communist Party for what's happened in China and not enough blame for what's happened in China. And this is part of the dynamic of us seeing communism as potentially successful. So we criticize these fools who thought that the Stalin regime was not going to kill them, was not going to produce famine. And yet we have this narrative that the Communist Party produced an economic miracle in China, which... I'm sorry, the Communist Party took advantage of the economic miracle in China, played a part in expropriated the hard work of many people, stole the businesses. A lot of those local officials just stole the land and stole the businesses from people who created a success. This is the thing that the party did that's really important. Deng Xiaoping first went to Japan in early 79, before he came to the US and met Carter, put on the cowboy hat, that gigantic 10-gallon hat that was bigger than he was. He was like 5 gallons, the hat was like 10 gallons. He goes to Japan, and you're looking at Japan, DK, and it lost the war. It was actually literally incinerated in the American use of atomic weapons. It was destroyed, it lost the war, and it's rising to be the second largest economy in the world. Like, what happened? How was that possible? How could Japan rise from the ashes, literally, when China won the war? It was on the winning side. And it's $200 per capita GDP. And Deng Xiaoping looks this over and he says, you know what the answer is? Japan is partners with America, not with the Soviet Union. And so Deng Xiaoping is going to divorce the Soviet Union economically, and he's going to marry the US. And so Deng gets most favored nation status in 1980, thanks to Jimmy Carter. Communist regime in Beijing gets most favored nation status, which has to be renewed every year, and is renewed every single year until 2000, 2001, when they're admitted to the WTO. Now, that's a Clinton initiative that happens right when Bush is going to come to office. And so the secret sauce is you have to manufacture and export to the American domestic market. because the American middle class is insatiable. They will buy anything as long as the quality is high and the price is low. Japan did this. Japan's two former colonies, Taiwan and South Korea, followed in Japan's footsteps. China's going to do this too. We're going to use this Japanese model, and the American middle class and their insatiable overconsumption is going to create the Chinese middle class. So this is what the party does, this geopolitical reorientation from a Soviet economic model to a Japan-style export-led partnership with the U.S. domestic market and middle class. They have a couple of tricks that are really important. They have Hong Kong. Hong Kong is a British-controlled, rule of law, international financial order that allocates capital based upon risk and return, not Communist Party dictates. Gorbachev, Soviet Union, they have nothing like Hong Kong. The only reason China has Hong Kong is because after World War II, when Truman announced that Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists were going to accept the Japanese surrender in Hong Kong, the British sent their boats in and took Hong Kong back themselves. So that when Mao defeated Chiang Kai-shek, he didn't have Hong Kong. The British had Hong Kong, and they created this international financial system that Mao's successors would be able to use. Yep. Had the British not done this, there would be no Hong Kong, and there would be no Chinese miracle in the Deng Xiaoping and after period. The other thing they have is they have overseas Chinese who know the culture, speak the language, and are going to do the FDI, again, routed through Hong Kong, so you have Taiwan. So ironically, the failure to win the Civil War 100%, we think of the Korean Peninsula as divided. We think of there's partition of the Korean Peninsula, but China is also partitioned. There's also Taiwan, still partitioned to this day. And Taiwan is the FDI that's going to come in through Hong Kong, routed through into the special economic zones on a risk-reward capitalist market basis, not a communist basis. And furthermore, they have the Japanese war guilt, because the Japanese committed those atrocities in China. So the Japanese are going to make up for what they did by helping rebuild China. Again, the FDI and the tech transfer, like it's coming from Taiwan. So Taiwan and Japan, this partitioned China and this guilty, the war guilt, through the British Hong Kong, is going to go into the special economic zones, manufacture things like the Japanese, and then export them to the American domestic consumers. And it's going to be T-shirts and at the beginning, and then they're going to, like the Japanese, and then they're going to climb the value chain until it's the highest value-added products, and then supply chains are going to change as a result, and nothing is made in one place anymore, and the world gets very complicated. But the point being is that Deng Xiaoping did that. That was intentional. That's the credit that the party deserves, and the party never gets, because it's a story not of the party's rule alone, but of British Hong Kong, Taiwan, Japan, United States, domestic market. And so how do you get rich in the modern world? You sell to America. Those countries that are partners with America and that are able to compete, the Chinese deserve credit. They can manufacture higher quality, lower cost products that American consumers will buy. American consumers are not forced to buy Chinese products. They're just better and they're cheaper. And so they buy them because it's a market and there's competition. So some countries in Bangladesh can do this in textiles. You referenced Bangladesh, which is how I got launched on this reverie that I hope is now ending. My point being is that the East Asian miracle, which is Japan selling to the American domestic market, followed by South Korea and Taiwan doing the same trick, and then followed by Deng Xiaoping's communist China, the same exact trick, filtered through British Hong Kong. The problem with the Chinese one is that they're not allies, former enemies who are allies, like Japan. They are former allies who are now enemies, who have done this magic sauce. And now we're in the pickle that we're in as a result of this. But the formula is, this is where the communists deserve the credit that they never get, whereas they get credit for things that they didn't do.
Yeah. Suppose Stalin had lost the succession battle in 1924, and somebody else is in power, but he's still on the Central Committee or the Politburo. And it's 1930. And suppose the other person is also in this way ruthless and is one by one getting rid of every single person in the inner circle. What would a Stalin-type figure have done if he found himself on the periphery of somebody else's regime?
So counterfactuals are really critical for historical thought. A lot of historians are pedantic about this, and they say we're against counterfactual. It's just speculation. But every single one of them is a practitioner. Why? If you say that Stalin caused collectivization, that means without Stalin, there's no collectivization. If you say Hitler caused World War II, you're doing the counterfactual. You're saying no Hitler, no World War II.
And just to put a finer point on my question, I mean, not just in the sense of whether collectivization would have happened, but more in the sense of how would he personally have avoided the fate of Bukharin and Kamenev and Zinoviev in terms of potentially I'm going to get purged someday. I don't want to be the toady to somebody else. How would he personally have navigated the sort of power struggle at being what Zinoviev was to Stalin or Bukharin was Stalin?
This is a question about how do you become Stalin? Could there have been another Stalin besides Stalin?
Yeah.
A lot of people will argue that you have this formative period when you're growing up, your parents, your schooling, the influences of your peers, and you become a certain personality. Part of it is genetic, and then a lot of it is the environment, and you have this then personality, and so you have to understand how the person formed, whether it's Picasso as a painter or Stalin as a dictator. And then if you understand their personality, you'll understand what they do in power.
Right.
The problem with that analysis is Stalin is not Stalin when he first gets into power. It's the experience of being in power that makes Stalin Stalin. It's the building the dictatorship within the dictatorship, and it's the enacting that kind of power that makes Stalin who he is. It's sitting in that chair. It's being in the Kremlin, running a Leninist regime, and being responsible for Russian power in the world against Nazi Germany, the UK, the US. So people say about Xi Jinping now, you know, Xi Jinping's made a lot of mistakes. If he had just kept to Deng Xiaoping's policies, China would be much better off.
Right.
We'd be still in a kind of détente or partnership with China, and instead we're at loggerheads and there's potential war. And the problem with that analysis is, what would Xi Jinping have done if he were the #1 guy under Deng Xiaoping instead of Deng? Maybe he would have done Deng's policies, just like Deng did. More importantly, what would Deng do if he were alive today instead of Xi Jinping? Would he do what Deng did in the 80s and 90s? Or would he do what Xi Jinping is doing today?
Yeah.
In other words, how much is the personality and how much is the system? How much is formation before you get into the position of power, and how much is the circumstances and responding to those circumstances and the exigencies of the moment and the way the system operates and the place the system is and what the larger context in the world looks like. So here you have a Communist Party seizes power, and as I said, unlike the case of Bavaria, southern Germany, northern Italy, Hungary, it holds power. It doesn't just seize power. The Paris Commune, 1870-71, they seized power in Paris, and then they were destroyed, put up against the wall and shot. So they seize and they hold power. But they're in this peasant country, and the peasant has the land de facto, and they're Marxists. So they believe that the base, the socioeconomic base, the class relations, determine the superstructure or the politics, right? Marxism, the base, the socioeconomic base, gives you the superstructure. Politics depends on, it's an outcome of what the base is. So you have a de facto capitalist base.
Yeah, I don't mean like whether they would have done collectivization. I mean like how would he personally, because he wants to be power.
I get that. So he makes this decision. All of them want to get rid of capitalist relations in the countryside. Every single one of them want to do that. They're all communists. They're all Marxist-Leninists. But they don't think it can be done. They think if you try it, you'll fail. So he goes and tries it. He creates even more destabilization than they had predicted. But he just powers through and gets there to the end and succeeds. And most of them are grateful that he's pulled this off because they thought it couldn't be done. So your question is, who else could have become Stalin in that position? Who else among the Marxist-Leninists could have been the guy who says, whether we can do this or not, we have to do this because we can't have a socioeconomic base that's capitalist and the communist regime will survive.
Right.
They were all ready to say that, but they weren't all ready to do that. Moreover, after he does it, they had criticized him during the process while he was doing it. He was the only one in his mind who was Marxist-Leninist enough to get it done, and they were all carping at him. So this is where you begin to see the paranoia, suspicion being magnified, where he then, in a few years after collectivization is more or less finished, he's going to go after them. So you needed a person who could have felt in their head that this was not only necessary, but doable, undertake those risks, power through no matter how much famine and resistance and upheaval and criticism there was, and then come out the other side of that as the victor with this gigantic secret police that was really small, but got really big in the process of doing the very thing that people said you couldn't do. And then having all of that and not destroying any rivals and going from dictatorship to despotism, right? So you would need a person who was capable of being Stalin in that group, not from outside that group, but inside that group, and then would either not use that power to destroy everybody else, not yearn for despotism, but be satisfied with dictatorship, where others exercise power in their domains, and yet still able to hold on to the system. So was there such a person in the circle? And could, if the answer is no, could that person have emerged in the process of doing it?
I guess my question is slightly different, which is that even if such a person did not exist, and suppose like Stalin already exists, he did all this stuff, and it's 1934, and you know, it seems like Stalin's starting to go a little Great Terror-y soon. And another copy of Stalin is in the Politburo, and just out of a sense of self-preservation, they're like, in a couple of years, I don't want to be writing my own confession and ending up in the gulag. Is Stalin, being the sort of power player that he was, and knowing how to align factions against each other to his own advantage in the very end, if somebody like him was in the Politburo, what would they have done? Or were they already there and there was nothing they could do by this point?
This is a question for every single dictatorship. Why didn't somebody just kill Stalin?
Yeah.
He was going to kill them all. Why didn't they just kill him and save themselves? So during the 20s, Stalin resigns 6 times. Yeah. 3 times in writing and 3 times orally, between 23 and 28. And every time, those guys around him beg him to stay.
Right.
So not only do they fail to try to push him out, but when he himself volunteers to go out, they beg him to stay. And then he kills all of them. Within 10 years, every one of them, just with a few exceptions, is dead. And so, geez, what were those guys thinking? It's clear that Stalin was not Stalin yet. If they knew in the 20s that in the 30s he was going to murder them all, maybe they would have acted the way you said. So he becomes Stalin in this process. He's not Stalin yet.
Yeah.
That's a really important argument that I make in the book. But today you look at Putin. Putin is ruining Russia. Why doesn't somebody just assassinate him? Xi Jinping. He's hurting China. He's making China enemies everywhere around the world when China was until recently popular. China was 75% favorable globally. Now it's 25% more or less favorable globally. That's Xi Jinping's doing. How can the elites around him let him do that? Around Putin, the people are falling out of windows. Instead of falling out of windows themselves, why don't they push him out the window? Khamenei in Iran.
Right.
He's brought ruin on the country. Why don't they take him out and try to save themselves and save the country, not just themselves? In other words, be patriotic as well as self-survival. And the answer is, it rarely happens. One, you have a collective action problem.
But sorry, why doesn't this prevent the Tsar? Is like people are trying to kill the Tsar constantly. They're killing Russian ministers in the Tsar's regime, and I think you in the
Hitler. There are more assassination attempts on Hitler, some of which come very close, than by
also
far on
Mussolini,
Stalin.
but never against Stalin. Why is that?
Stalin is the guy who is building and personifying the system. The people around Stalin can see that he is unusually good at dictatorship. He is just carrying this entire system on his back through thick and thin, killing enemies, liquidating the kulaks, collectivizing agriculture, building a military-industrial complex, defeating Hitler in war. I mean, how much better from with the system's logic, not from humanity's logic, not from the point of view of the kind of values that you and I share? How much better are you going to do than Stalin? And so there is a way in which they're pygmies and he's Stalin. So of course they know that they can't do what he does. And if they try to unseat him, they might save their lives, but they might lose the system and the radiant future, the overthrow of capitalism, the abundance, peace, paradise on earth. That's a big move to lose if you believe in that, if your life is about that and you're dedicated to that. But in addition, you have a collective action problem that's really important. So let's suppose that I'm in a Stalin regime with you. You're a functionary and I'm a functionary. And Stalin's collectivizing agriculture, which means he's destroying the productivity. And we're going to be poor all the way through the Brezhnev period. We're going to be importing wheat, even though we have this gigantic agricultural belt, wheat belt. Some people knew in real time that this was self-harm. And I come to you and I say, this Stalin guy, he's wrecking everything. We got to take him down. You agree with me. But you know what? You don't know. Maybe I've been sent by Stalin to test your loyalty. Maybe I'm provoking you to reveal your disloyalty. Maybe I'm not being sincere. So instead, you agree with me, but instead of saying, yes, let's do it, immediately you run to Stalin and you say that this Kotkin guy is talking behind your back about how we need to take you down. Because you're going to preserve self-preservation. You're going to preserve yourself. Because you don't trust. There's a lack of trust inside these dictatorships. If you knew that Stalin hadn't sent me, for sure, 100%, you would say, you know, you're right. You got a point there. What can we do about this? But you know that Stalin is constantly doing these provocations, or you suspect he is. And you know that he's got people, provocateurs, who are around the system, doing things like this. And the secret police are listening in on your phone conversations. And the driver of your car works for Stalin, doesn't work for you, and is reporting any overheard conversations in the car. And the maid in your apartment is also working for the secret police and reporting up the chain of command. So the system that you're in enmeshes you in this distrust, in this surveillance and distrust. So what looks like, geez, let's just take him down and save our own life, let alone save the country, looks like, yes, it's logical, but that's not the kind of lives that they led. We would think that based upon the kind of lives and the system that we live
But
in.
there's a bunch of revolutionaries who try to kill the Tsar and sometimes succeed. And they're just like random people. They're not like people in the regime. They're just random people. Why doesn't the Kulak, one of the 100 million enslaved people?
The Tsar has less security than Stalin does.
But didn't you say in the Kata that in 1928 he had like one bodyguard when he would go to his dacha?
The bodyguard stuff increases over time. But the regime is walled off from the people. Stalin doesn't go out in public. He's not one of these populist types in public who's bathing in the adulation of the crowd. He's in the office, he's at the dacha, he's at the party meeting, he's at the party congress. And so he's not putting himself at risk in these. But even so, it is paradoxical because when Hitler goes to make a speech, every year Hitler makes a speech in Munich. And it's known when he's going to make the speech. It's announced in the paper. And there are a couple of assassination attempts on Hitler, one of which takes place in the hall, where someone plants a bomb. It's a working class guy, plants a bomb there. And the bomb goes off, it blows up. But Hitler left the hall more quickly than anticipated, based on the schedule that people thought he would be there longer. He was quicker, he was out. And so the bomb exploded and he survived. There are military officials who try to kill Hitler famously in 1944. They plant a bomb under the table, which also goes off and almost gets him, but doesn't get him during a military briefing. And so there are attempts on Hitler's life, both from the society and from inside the regime. And Stalin doesn't have this. In fact, the people inside the regime are killing themselves. When they see that Stalin is leading them down a blind alley of murder and ration tickets and gulag, they kill themselves rather than kill Stalin. So again, there's something special about the mentality of these communists. And there's also something about Stalin's success as well as the threat that he represents to these individuals. Still, it is mysterious because there were opportunities and people didn't take up the opportunities. The very few, there's no serious assassination attempt on Stalin. The very few times when they accused somebody of doing an assassination, for example, there were shots fired at a boat when Stalin was on holiday in the south. It was not because Stalin was in the boat. It was because the boat was not in the system as marked, as allowed to use that waterway. And so they were just performing their duties as border guards,
That's funny.
shooting at the boat in it. It got dressed up as an assassination attempt, and people were arrested and executed, and it was publicized as such, but they didn't know that Stalin was in the boat.
Yeah. So you've written other books about the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
And there's this last-ditch effort in the Eastern Bloc where there's falling productivity to borrow more money, invest more into finding this last-ditch technological miracle that can cure all their problems. How similar is that, in your opinion, to what's happening in China? Because the dissimilarity is that while Eastern Europe was struggling to export and they had a trade deficit, China, many people argue, is exporting too much. Do you see any similarity between where Eastern Europe was in 1989 versus where China is today, or is it you're not as concerned about China right now?
It's a very difficult question to answer very briefly, but it's a really important question. There are tremendous differences, of course, civilizational differences, let alone system differences. And we wouldn't want to elide those differences. What's similar is the Marxist-Leninist monopoly on power.
Yeah.
People ask me, is China a Marxist-Leninist regime? And I usually say it's a Leninist regime because that's undisputable.
Right.
Do they believe in the Marxism or not? People disagree on this. How many true believers are there? Is Xi Jinping a true believer? That's a difficult argument to win because the evidence is contradictory and because we don't know the inside of the system well. It's still in power, it hasn't fallen. But it's clearly a Leninist system. And a Leninist system can't be half pregnant. You can't be half communist. You either have a communist monopoly or you don't. So what happens in communist political reform, not economic reform, where they allow some market behavior, but where you liberalize the system and you open it up politically. So you say, DK, okay, let's have debate inside the party. Let's allow pluralism inside the party's rule. Meaning we're going to keep the party, but we're going to allow different tendencies in the party. The problem with that is some wiseacre raises their hand and says, I don't want the Communist Party. I want a Social Democratic Party, or I want a right-wing party, or I want a centrist party. And you say, no, that's not the rules here. The rule is only debate within the party's monopoly, not that you can have another party. So what happens is there's no way for them to open debate and then to put a lid on the debate. It becomes a Pandora's box.
Yep.
You can't be half communist, half monopoly. You either have the monopoly or you don't. So every time they liberalize politically, the system liquidates itself.
Yeah.
Hungary in 56, Czechoslovakia in 68, and Gorbachev. Had Gorbachev not happened, China might have done its own Gorbachev. Had they not seen Gorbachev accidentally liquidate the party, they might have done political reform, opened up the party, and watched the thing unravel.
Yep.
Or they would have had a crackdown and put the lid back on, much bigger than the Tiananmen episode in June 1989. So they're not going to do political reform because they know from studying the Gorbachev case, which everybody studies in party school, which is where all the cadre have to go to be trained. They're not going to open up the system politically because that's suicide. And they're not going to commit suicide like what happened with Gorbachev. So this means their policy options, their menu of policy options is limited. They can open up the economy, but if it gets too open and too liberalized, too many people with independent sources of power and wealth, too many Jack Ma's, they lose control potentially. So they can open up the system economically, but then they got to somehow reimpose controls. But if they reimpose too much controls, the GDP goes down and they don't have the job creation. So you have this constant back and forth of how much economic liberalization you can have before it becomes a threat, or how little economic liberalization you can have before it becomes a threat to your ability to create jobs and wealth. So that's the dilemma they're in. The Soviets in the 70s and 80s were looking at the system, and they didn't want to change the system Gorbachev style. They didn't want to liberalize it politically. They were willing to introduce some market economic liberalization, some market incentives. They tried that in 65. It actually didn't work. And anyway, then the Prague Spring happened in 68 and scared the bejesus out of them. Reform looked like the end of the system. So they tried a little bit of economic liberalization. It didn't work. They didn't want to open up the system politically. So what's left? Technological fantasies.
Yes.
Maybe technology can perfect planning, so all the pathologies of the planned economy, all the inefficiencies of the planned economy can be overcome with computers. Maybe if we invest heavily in tech, we don't have to do the hard choices of deep and fundamental structural change, which would end our party's monopoly. We can keep the party, we can keep the party's monopoly, we can even keep the state-owned economy, but we can just tweak it with the tech and supercharge it or even turbocharge it and make it work that way. So computers, tech will save us from the hard choices of deep structural reform, which will threaten our power.
Right.
We know how that worked. It didn't work. Now you're looking at China today. You have a Communist Party monopoly. You can't be half pregnant. So you can't open up politically. So how are you going to reintroduce the dynamism? How are you going to get the GDP growth? How are you going to get the job creation? How are you going to get the societal buy-in? Because if you go too far in that direction, that could threaten the regime. And if you don't go far, so tech, we got tech. The tech can make our dictatorship function better. Not just our economy, our productivity, our job creation, managing through the demographic crisis. Not just the economic and social benefits from tech that tech could live, but tech could maybe even make our communist dictatorship immune from challenges because of the surveillance is all encompassing, because of our ability to spot things before they happen. And so you can see where they would be so seduced, so tempted that tech is the solution. here's the problem with that argument. First, it didn't work the last time. That doesn't mean it won't work this time, but the track record, even though it's a small number of cases, is not good. But the other problem is political legitimacy. You can't get political legitimacy. You might have thought that, oh, geez, if the GDP grows, that'll give us the legitimacy. Then the GDP stops growing, and you no longer have the economic benefits to claim that that's why you're in power.
But do you need it? Like Stalin didn't have strong growth in the 20s and 30s, and it seems like you just double down on repression. Like if you double down on the NKVD,
Yeah.
Like the Tsar actually had 2% growth up to 1917, huh?
They're dead. They're in the
So
cemetery.
that's the point, right? The growth.
They're dead, and the system is gone. So it's fundamentally a deficit of political legitimacy. So when we talk about Iran today, and how Russia and China didn't even help them with any military support or economic support while they're under tremendous strain from Israel rolling back Iranian power. And so they kind of got betrayed by their strategic partners. The strategic partnership among the authoritarian regimes is a fake. That's true. It is a fake. They're out for themselves. They're opportunistic, and they will help the others to the extent that they feel it's helping for themselves. And the day that they feel it's not helping themselves, forget it, right? But there's a deeper problem there. What Iranian regime needs is political legitimacy. That's what it doesn't have. It's not just a failure economically. It's not just a failure in security in its foreign policy terms. It's hated by its own people. It's got maybe 20% support in the population. And a lot of people are indifferent, but a majority of the people despise this regime, want to see it go. They're patriots for Iran, but they detest the mullah's clerical regime. Neither Russia nor China can give political legitimacy to Iran. They can give dual-use technology. They can give them missiles. They can give them anti-missile defense. They can never give them political legitimacy. And that's the vulnerability, which is why Iran is on the precipice now, because the regime is illegitimate. And the regime knows that it's illegitimate in the eyes of the people.
I guess you'd like to think that that's the main thing that matters, but historically it just seems like when authoritarians crack down really hard, it kind of just works, right?
That's why they have gigantic repressive apparatuses.
Yeah.
Because people talk about a bargain. The Chinese made a bargain, or the Russians made a bargain. The people gave up their freedom, and the regime provides a higher standard of living. So there's this bargain. There is no bargain, because if the regime fails to raise the standard of living, the people can't sue them in court.
Right. Yeah.
They can't say, oh, you didn't live up to your end of the bargain.
Yeah.
We gave away our freedom, but you didn't deliver on your part of the bargain, so the deal's over. You're out of power now because you didn't live up to your bargain. Instead, they repress. They bring out the batons. They bring out the water cannon. They bring out the disappearances where people are arrested, and they're not even arrested in cause. They're not even indicted. They just disappear them. And so you have this huge repressive apparatus, and it seems to work, especially when you have this moment where you fail to live up to some of the promises that you made. The challenge for them there is somebody has to do the repression. The repressive apparatus is not a machine. It's not AI. It's not something which is mechanical. It's people. It's people who grew up in neighborhoods, come from villages, went to the schools with other people. This brings us back to the Tsarist regime where we started. The Tsarist secret police wasn't big enough to keep the lid on, so they had to use the military. The military was a peasant army. They were peasants in uniform. And the working class, including women, were striking for bread in the capital and marching in the capital for bread in 1917. And the military was told to shoot them. And these are elite military units. Shoot these workers. And they're peasants. And you think, okay, peasants, they'll shoot workers, right? No love lost. The workers were peasants yesterday. And some of them were still peasants who went back to the villages where these soldiers were from. During downtime at the factory, during harvest time, they were the same people. And the army decided not to shoot. There came a point where the regime called out the repression, and the repressors had agency and didn't repress. And so that's what happens in these cases. You never know when it's going to happen. It's very hard to predict beforehand. But there comes a moment where the people who are supposed to do the shooting decide not to shoot. The people who are supposed to do the arresting, they decide not to arrest. The people who are doing the surveillance, they decide to stop. So you have this huge repressive apparatus, and it works until the moment the people in it decide not to do it anymore. And so that's where the political legitimacy variable is ultimately decisive. Because those people who are killing under communism and collectivizing those villages and dekulakizing and killing the people in their native village that they had grown up with, if they hadn't done that, the regime couldn't have done this. The regime couldn't have collectivized. Stalin wasn't out there shooting people. He was signing the decree, which then got transported through the system, communicated through the system, to the point of the activist who enacted it or not, as the case might be. When they don't enact, your power evaporates like a bank run. Right. You look at the bank and you think, wow, that's pretty solid. They got these neoclassical columns. It's all made out of stone. Looks really impressive. This bank is really solid. And then one day, it gets in people's heads that the bank might not have your money. The bank might not be good in reality for your paper holdings. And so you rush the bank to try to get your money out before that money is gone or doesn't exist. And everybody gets that idea at the same time, not just one person, and you get a bank run. And so this really solid institution with these neoclassical stone columns turns out to be evaporates, evanescent. You can have a political bank run in the repressive apparatus.
effervescent,
They cease thinking that they should kill people like themselves on behalf of a system that they are no longer loyal to, no longer adhering to. That can happen in the forces of order, as we call them, in the repressive apparatus. It can happen inside the elite. That's because when the leader gives the order, it's got to go through the whole chain of command. The leader doesn't give the order to the soldier. It goes to the one boss, the subordinate to that boss, the subordinate, and anywhere along the chain of command, there can be disloyalty and revolt. There can be what we call political defection. And so what motivates, what triggers political defection? The lack of legitimacy, political illegitimacy. People are not going to die for something that they no longer believe in. And so that's a really big problem that the communist regime can't solve with tech. And you say, well, the tech could produce power and prosperity, and China could re-legitimize its rule, just like it did with the economic growth. And so the economic growth did it for 30, 40 years, and that's how the regime legitimated itself. And then the tech will do that for the next 30, 40 years. And the answer is that hasn't happened yet. So maybe it can do that, and maybe it can't, but it's never permanent. What's permanent is power rooted in the people. What's permanent is they're real citizens. They have real freedoms. They have the right to vote. Now, they can't get what they want. They go to the polls and they see bad candidate, worse candidate, even worse candidate. But they can punish what they don't like. They can exercise that agency. They can be citizens. They can realize their citizenship, just like we do as consumers in the marketplace, consumers of podcasts. And so that's where you get legitimacy from, where the system enables people. Opportunity at home. Opportunity for people who otherwise don't have opportunity. That's legitimacy. That's priceless. China doesn't have that. Russia doesn't have that. Stalin had that legitimacy for a time based upon the idea that he was building a new world and overcoming the horrors of capitalism and imperialism and world war. And Khrushchev gave a second wind to that, even as he was revealing more of the horrors. And then that just ran out. And they unwittingly destroyed the system, trying to give it a third wind under Gorbachev.
Right.
And so they have no way forward. They're stuck. They can't do structural reform and maintain their power. But without structural reform, without a legitimate system, they also can't maintain their power forever. So it's really interesting. In the short run, we're all dead, because there could be a World War III. But in the long run, we're all good, because our system is better. So we have to elongate the short run. No world war between the US and China. Get to the long run. Get to the competition. Get to the Cold War instead of hot war, where we're not having hot war. That's the beauty of Cold War. It's not hot war. You can compete. You can have tensions. You can have rivalries, but you don't have hot war. And so in the short run, potentially we're all dead, because a world war with great powers, it was 55 million in World War II, the low estimate of deaths. That was a multiple of World War I. And World War III would be a multiple of World War II. If we can avoid that, in the long run, we're good. It's the opposite of what Keynes said about in the long run, we're all dead. It's in the short run that we're potentially dead. But I like the long run. And so the tech and China thing might work, and it might not work, but it's not permanent, even if it does work.
All right, great note to close on. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It was a real pleasure to talk to you.
My pleasure. I apologize for not being succinct in my answers, but if you've read some of my books, not all of them, some of them go on at length.
Yes.
A few of them are short, though. And I have to master the answers to questions on podcasts in order to be able to get through your whole magnificent list. Maybe next time we'll do better.
Yes, the long run, the long drawdown is why I want you on the podcast, right? A lot of these issues are complicated, so I appreciate you doing it. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, the most helpful thing you can do is just share it with other people who you think might enjoy it. Send it to your friends, your group chats, Twitter, wherever else. Just let the word go forth. Other than that, super helpful if you can subscribe on YouTube and leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Check out the sponsors in the description below. If you want to sponsor a future episode, go to dwarkesh.com/advertise. Thank you for tuning in. I'll see you on the next one.
So you need to win the peace. This will be the main topic of my discussion with you today. Not just the war, but the peace. So as my wife likes to say, Asia is half the world, but all of time. And yet, when we discuss the Cold War, we are mostly preoccupied with Europe. When in fact, as this audience knows best, Asia must be a central part of our story. And in fact, Asia and European Cold War theaters are, of course, connected. The story you know well, the Iron Curtain, the tragic story, how Stalin took over half of Europe. It's a tragic story for the most part. But in fact, the Cold War story is not a tragic story. It is an uplifting story, because there's a miracle in Western Europe, and there's a miracle in East Asia, all during the Cold War. So in fact, the Cold War could be seen not as a tragic story, but as a triumphal story, or at least as something combining both the tragedy and the triumph. I'm going to try that today. I'm going to speak, my first point is I'm going to speak about what I call 4 partitions in East Asia. 4 partitions in East Asia: Korea, of course, Japan, Vietnam, and China. Korea at 38th parallel, Japan at the northern island chain connected to Hokkaido, which was renamed the Southern Koreas. Vietnam first at the 16th parallel and then at the 20th parallel, and China at Taiwan and Hong Kong. Partition. Of course, some of these partitions are still with us today. 4 partitions is my first point. This is an unusual way to describe this period, but I think it should be the common way that we describe this period. And as I show, I hope, in the rest of this talk today, they are interconnected. So let me get to point number 2, this Cold War or the post-war. No country was ready for the post-war. It's impossible to be ready when the war ends for the post-war. You can do the plans, you can make the memoranda, but when the fighting stops, there's a big vacuum. And everyone is rushing to fill the vacuum. This is natural. It's predictable, even if it's not preventable. And so people rightly say that post-war solutions were improvised. For example, they say Stalin had no plan to conquer Eastern Europe. He improvised the plan, which is true. But you know, every time he improvised in the direction of freedom, of parliaments, of democracy, of rule of law. Actually, no. Every time he improvised in the direction of unfreedom, of coercion, of executions, of deportations. So it is a form of improvisation, but it is one that is based in fundamental values and institutions, unfortunately. So you cannot say only that everything is improvised. Improvised on the basis of what? What values, what institutions? Unfreedom. If you spend some time in the Communist Party archives of any country, it's quite frightening to see the moral squalor and the horrors committed in the name of the people. I've spent my entire life, longer than some of you I see have been on the planet, reading these documents. And they hold big lessons for us. So, no country was ready. Everybody was improvising, but Soviet Union was improvising only in one direction, the direction of unfreedom. And they were doing it very, very vigorously. Okay, point number 3. There was a lot of confusion because the wartime allies thought that they would keep the alliance. This was a crazy, delusional idea, but you can understand it. Who wants to continue war? The war is over. Great victory over Germany and Japan. Who wants a new war or a new conflict? They are all dreaming of a post-war of continued cooperation, but the interests diverge completely. And so there's this period of confusion when they are hoping for a better world without the conflict, but the interests diverge tremendously. Again, the focus is on Europe, especially Poland. Poland has no strategic value for the world order. Yes, that's true, unfortunately. It has tremendous value for the Poles, but Poland was a part of the Russian Empire, and Stalin was going to make sure that he controlled Poland again. So the decision was made already, 1944-45, about Poland. The big story was the China story. This is the story where the history was more open. China could go in multiple directions, and it was the most consequential for the world order. And it was the one that they paid less attention to compared to Europe and Poland. Again, for Poland, it's everything. It's existential. It's the existence of their country. I don't mean to diminish the importance of the post-war for the Poles. Nothing is more important. But for the world order, Poland has much less significance than China does, but the attention is on Poland and not so much on China. Okay. Point number 4. The Cold War was an achievement. It was a high-order achievement. I know this doesn't sound obvious or even true, but it is true. You see, the history of the Cold War is written as if it was a mistake, as if it was avoidable, as if somebody needs to be blamed for what happened in the Cold War. Blame Truman. If you're on the left, you blame American imperialism. If you're on the right, you blame Stalin. So blaming Truman, blaming Stalin, some people blame both, as if it's a misunderstanding. But it is a fundamental clash of interests and values. It's not a misunderstanding. They could talk more and it wouldn't help, because the interests, and even deeper than the interests, the values, are fundamentally opposed. And this, you must recognize this fundamental clash of interest and values and fight back against the values and interests of the other side. So Truman should get credit for the Cold War, not blame. And Stalin also gets credit, because the Americans didn't want to fight the Cold War. They just wanted to go home. But Stalin made sure that the Americans engaged in the Cold War. Every time the Americans said no more, Stalin would do something. Coup in Czechoslovakia. We have the ambassador here. The coup in February 1948 in Czechoslovakia. It frightened the naive people who thought there would be cooperation in the post-war. The Berlin crisis. Of course, the Chinese Revolution. And the most important event, tragic event for consolidating America behind the Cold War, was the North Korean invasion of South Korea. So Truman gets credit for recognizing the need to mobilize, and Stalin gets perverse credit because he kept pushing the Americans to mobilize in this Cold War. Let me drive the point home a little bit deeper about point number 4, the Cold War is an achievement. When two great powers clash, there are only 4 options. Great power competition, history knows only 4 options. I founded the Global History Initiative at Princeton University a long time ago, and I've been spending my whole life on this problem. The 4 options of great power, rivalry, tension, competition. Number 1 is hot war. Hot war, which is the worst option, of course. This is tens and tens of millions of dead. You know, World War II was at least 55 million dead. That's the lowest estimate. If we have a World War III, God forbid, it will be a multiple of 55 million for sure. So hot war is one option, and it's the worst option. The second option is appeasement. Appeasement is when you try to accommodate the interests of the adversary, and you discover that the more you accommodate, the more that they want. As we say, the appetite grows in the eating. And if you give, they want more. And if you give, they want more. So appeasement is appealing in some ways because you don't have a hot war, but then you are fooled because eventually you get the hot war in any case. It's just you get it on worse terms if you do appeasement. So I don't like hot war, and I don't like appeasement. Number 3 option is what we call Pygmalion. If you know from George Bernard Shaw, the play Pygmalion, where he finds the street urchin girl, the girl on the street, and he says, we make her into a lady. We transform her personality. This is known as transforming China into a responsible stakeholder in the international system. It is Pygmalion. It is when you as the outside power think that you are able to transform the culture and institutions of another great power from the outside. It is very seductive, Pygmalion, because we have the example of post-war Japan, post-war West Germany, post-war Korea, post-war Taiwan, and almost no more cases than that. So it's very seductive, the Pygmalion. And you just saw the United States try it with Russia and China in the post-Cold War. And it doesn't work. Because they don't want to be responsible stakeholders in the international system. They want to change the international system. They want their own international system. So you think you're doing Pygmalion, but what you're doing is you're strengthening them for their ability to overthrow your international system. So I don't like hot war. I don't like appeasement. I don't like Pygmalion. What's left? Cold War. Cold War is the 4th and best option in great power competition. That's true. I could give case after case. What's good about Cold War? It's not hot war. That's the main thing that's good about it. It allows for peaceful, predominantly peaceful, not exclusively peaceful, but predominantly peaceful relations between two great powers. There can be not just competition, but also cooperation, as there was in the scientific realm between the United States and the Soviet Union. Tremendous levels of cooperation. I remember I was alive. So, let me just finish this opening 4th point. It's paradoxical, but you only have 4 options in great power rivalry, and only one of them is a good option, Cold War. Again, it's not a mistake, it's not a misunderstanding, it's a fundamental conflict, institutions, and values. My 5th point, I only have 10. I wrote a 20,000 word paper, but you're getting only superficial version. I'm very good at superficial versions of papers. Like the rock, when it skips across the water and it makes a small ripple, but you don't see the under the water. The under the water is in the paper. And also in the Stalin Volume 3. The 5th point is just how fluid the situation was in 1945. In retrospect, everything looks clear. But in prospect, looking forward, not so clear. Very uncertain, but also very fluid. There were 2 gigantic factors that were not fluid that had to be mastered. One was communism, and the other was revolutionary nationalism. Communism and revolutionary nationalism. And in fact, their combination, their alignment, was the big problem for the post-1945 war. So it's fluid, it's open, it's not inevitable, but you have to manage the challenge of communism and the challenge of revolutionary nationalism. And very few people alive understood this. Only a tiny number of people understood that the post-war was about having answers to communism and to revolutionary nationalism, and especially their combination. Okay, so that's by way of introducing the problem. Now let's go more deeply into the cases. I start with the Korean case and the division at the 38th parallel. I look at this room and I say, there's nothing I can tell you that you don't know. You already know the whole story, where the 38th parallel idea came from, how the US officers were looking for the maps and only found the silly map from National Geographic, how the 38th parallel is not really a geographic line. It's kind of a crazy place to try to draw a boundary because of the rivers and the topography. So you know the story. I'm going to teach you nothing. You can be assured of that. You know that the Soviet troops were going in and the US troops were far away. That already on August 15th, the day that the Japanese surrendered, Stalin's Red Army was 50 miles down the coast of Korea and moving rapidly. And the US, this is August 15th, and the US has nobody on the peninsula till September 8th at the earliest. Okay, so this story you know. Maybe what needs to be reminded, however, is US troop concentrations, deployments, and capabilities. So the US troops were needed in the minds of the planners for the invasion of the Japanese home islands. And so having spare troops available for military occupation was not something that they could plan very easily, because no one thought the Japanese were going to surrender so quickly. And in fact, the US thought the surrender would come, as you know, in 1946 at the earliest. In addition, the US, once the Japanese surrendered, they were not confident that the Japanese would accept the surrender. The US was concerned about possible rebellion on the Japanese home islands against the surrender. So MacArthur planned to have a lot of troops to control the home islands even after the surrender. And it may look like the Americans had a lot of troops, but the requests for American troops were very, very high. General Wedemeyer, who was the top military advisor to Chiang Kai-shek, Japan surrendered, and he asked for 8 divisions for China, let alone for Japan or Korea. Also, America is an expeditionary army. America goes places. It's a sea power and an air power. The Soviet Union, the Red Army, is a land army. Land armies are what you need to occupy and hold territory. Expeditionary forces, they operate in the maritime realm, on the coastal lines. Again, they can go everywhere, but to sit internally in a country for a long period of time, that's not the best part of an expeditionary force. So America could get troops anywhere in the world quickly, but keeping them there for long periods of time was more complicated for the Americans than for the Soviet Union. Also, Stalin didn't have so much trouble if he wanted to keep the troops as long as he wanted. There was no public campaign to, quote, bring the boys home in the Soviet Union. In fact, there was no public campaign of any kind in the Soviet Union because, again, it's unfree. And so Stalin had the advantage of being able to use a land army for occupation and not worry about any pressure to bring them home. That's a form of planning, in a way, post-war planning, ironically. Okay, so you know all of this. Maybe we need to introduce the Austrian comparison for the Korean 38th parallel, because Austria is also occupied. The Soviet Red Army is also in Austria. But they leave, and there's not a communist partition of one part of Austria. The Austrians themselves, before the occupation, form a political establishment, a political government. The Austrians announce a government of their own, a coalition government, and Stalin accepts the Austrian government. You know, of course, that the Koreans do the same thing. They have a government that they announce, an indigenous government, and Stalin does not accept the Korean government. By the way, the Americans don't like it much either. But why does Stalin accept the Austrian self-declared government and not impose a Soviet-style regime in Austria, but he doesn't do the same in Korea? The reason, my understanding of the reason, is that Stalin is concerned to hold Germany down. He doesn't want Germany to annex Austria again. He doesn't want a revived German power. So he wants a stable Austria. So he concedes to the acceptance of a non-communist government in Austria so that it's successful and it doesn't become an unstable plaything in the hands of a revived German power. So he goes against his usual behavior and he accepts the Austrian centrist government, does not impose a communist government in Austria. In Korea, you see he has no control in Korea over the Japanese occupation. He has big control over German occupation, including in Berlin. But in Japan, he's blocked out by Truman and has no control. So Korea is the answer in some ways to the lack of control over Japan. He has a good stronghold over Germany in his mind, and he doesn't want Germany to include Austria again in a revival. In Japan, he's got no hold, so he will hold a piece of Korea as his insurance. Yeah. So the Austrian comparison tells you quite a bit. Now, there's an important paradox, though. Again, the paradox is that Stalin could have invaded and taken the whole Korean peninsula. I know there are arguments in the literature about this, but if you look at the Soviet documentation, they were very persuaded that the whole peninsula was available for their conquest. And remember, if many Red Army soldiers die, it's okay. He goes to the collective farms where the peasantry is enslaved, and he gets more soldiers. And if he loses 1 million, he'll go get another 1 million, because he doesn't value life. And so we think, oh, it would be hard to take more territory. There might be resistance. Yes, there might be resistance, okay. And he will kill them if need be. Think about Stalin's mentality. You have Pyongyang, which is the Jerusalem of East Asia, 33% Christian population, and you have Seoul, which is the hotbed of communist underground resistance to Japanese rule. Why would he not take the communist underground city? Of course he would if he were Stalin. Why would he not take all the valuable property in the south? Of course he would take it. Why not? Who's going to stop him? The Americans don't have any troops on the peninsula till September 8th. By that time, he could bang his way down if necessary. And even when the Americans come, he can bang down farther till he meets up with them. But he doesn't. Why? So, again, a paradox. People say that it was Roosevelt's mistake to bring Stalin into Northeast Asia because Roosevelt invited the Red Army into Japan. Well, okay, but did Stalin need the invitation? No. He needed no invitation. He was coming. He was coming. Yes. If Roosevelt didn't invite him, he was coming. And he was taking. So it's not the Roosevelt mistake. It is the Japanese aggression that has brought Stalin into Northeast Asia. Just like it's Hitler's aggression that has brought Stalin into Central Europe. So the reason Korea is divided is because of the Japanese aggression, not because of Roosevelt's mistake. But it's divided at the 38th parallel when it could have been much farther down, maybe the whole thing. Why? Because of the Kuril Islands. Yes. This brings me now to my next point. In Japan, there's a group of islands which are just north of Hokkaido. They are part of Hokkaido according to the 1854-55 treaty and maps signed by Russia and Japan. But they are redefined by Stalin as the Southern Kurils. This is Itofuro, Kunashiri, Shikotan, and Habomai. They're very small little island groups, but they're very important for sea access and for military calculations. And as I said, they are not part of the definition of the Kurils. And when Stalin first sends his military after the Kurils, they have orders only for the northern Kurils, not for Itofuro and below. And the Americans have forces close enough to take them. And the Americans ask Stalin for an air base on Itofuro. And Stalin says no. Stalin says no. And the Americans are shocked. They want the temporary landing rights, air landing rights on Itofuro. And Stalin says no. Just as Truman said no to Stalin about invasion of Hokkaido, Stalin says no to Truman about the air base. But the American military could have taken it. They could have held it. Instead, it became part of the Southern Kurils. And so Truman is negotiating with Stalin by telegram. No Hokkaido, air base in Itofuro, both denied, right? Deny Hokkaido to Stalin, deny Itofuro to the Americans. So the irony, the paradox, is that Truman wants the 38th parallel because he doesn't have the forces to hold a piece of Korea. And so he doesn't want to risk angering Stalin over 38th parallel, so he concedes the Kuril Island to Stalin. So the Japanese aggression causes Stalin coming into Northeast Asia and bringing the Soviet Union to the 38th parallel, but the partition of Japan causes Korea to be able to hold South Korea to have everything below the 38th parallel. Otherwise, you don't have it. So this is a crazy paradox. On the one hand, the Japanese caused the trouble, and on the other hand, the Japanese rescued the situation. Because Truman does not want to lose the 38th parallel, which he cannot enforce militarily, so he's afraid to anger Stalin, he concedes on the Kurils. So the Japanese partition, the redefinition of the four islands, Itofuro, Kunashiri, Shikotan, Habomai, as Southern Kurils, saves the 38th parallel for South Korea. And as a result, look what we have. One of the most successful societies ever in history. South Korea, rebuilding with the armistice after 1953, after the tragic war. So again, this paradox. The Japanese bring Stalin into communism into Northeast Asia, and the Japanese suffer in order for the Koreans to have the 38th parallel as the line. I know it's a crazy idea, But then again, look who I am. Okay. Now we go for Vietnam, 16th parallel. It's coming together. These are all interrelated, and you'll see there's a big picture here, even if it's a little bit superficial. How are we doing in the back? We okay? Still following? Everybody still awake? It's unusual. I'm speaking so long and everyone is still awake. Must be a good translation. Okay. All right. Vietnam. So here again, multiple paradoxes in Vietnam. You know General Order number 1, which is the order for surrender. To whom will the Japanese troops surrender? General Order number 1. And it's hurried. It's very hurried. Again, the Americans are not ready. The Japanese surrender, and the order, they're drafting it, and they only have a few days, and they don't know what they're doing, and they don't know the geography, and they don't have good maps, and it's crazy. But it's war, and now it's surrender. And so they decide, General Order number 1, that northern Indochina is part of the China theater of combat. The Chinese have troops on the border next to Indochina, Vietnam, and Chiang Kai-shek is commander of China theater. So the Japanese troops in northern Indochina, Vietnam, in the north, will surrender to the Chinese. And those in the southern part of Indochina will surrender to Southeast Asia Command, as it was called, which the commander is Mountbatten, so it's British. So the British are given the surrender in South Indochina, and the Chinese nationalist regime, the government of Chiang Kai-shek, is given the surrender in northern Indochina. Okay, it sounds reasonable, right? It's completely crazy. Why? This is why. So in the south, where the British, Mountbatten, takes surrender, the plan is to hand the territory back to the French. The British are going to bring the French colonial government back to South Vietnam, against the will of the Vietnamese people, but in cooperation with their French ally. And so they do this. The French don't have any troops yet. I mean, the French have lost the war. They're on the winning side only by the grace of the US and the UK. So the French don't have any troops. So who are the troops for the British to bring the French back? Yes, it's the Japanese troops, of course. So the Japanese troops, which have destroyed French rule in Indochina, are now the ones to help bring French rule back to Indochina, 1945-46. But it's not only the Japanese troops who are available for the neo-imperialism, it's also the British troops. But the British troops are all from India. All of the British troops that Mountbatten is commanding to retake Vietnam are from India. So in India, they fight and win their independence, and in Indochina, they help the British, alongside the Japanese, reimpose colonialism. At home, independence; abroad, colonialism. Yes,